Switching gears a little bit to Gregory Phelan, who's in the Coles College of Business in the Department of Economics, Finance, and Quantitative Analysis, and his talk is about economics of education science without a lab.
Thank you. So, my name is Greg Phelan. I'm an assistant professor of economics and a senior research fellow with our Education Economics Center in the Coles College of Business. Our mission in the Education Economics Center is to promote and develop sound policy through the use of data and evidence brought to bear on education issues. When I tell people what I do for a living, often they question why an economist like me is studying education. That's a fair sort of question to have. Typically, we think of economists as studying things like international trade and gross domestic product, maybe financial markets and derivatives, or like prices and inflation. Those are important things that many of my colleagues in the economics department study, but when you get to the core of what economics is, it's really about studying incentives and the decisions that people make based off those incentives. It just turns out that money is a really nice, convenient way of measuring those incentives and then quantifying up the decisions that people are making based off of them. So when we sort of shift our sort of framework and think about education policy as a set of incentives for students and families and policymakers, well then the decisions that those students and their families, their educators and other policymakers are making end up inherently being economic in nature, okay? I titled this presentation, Science Without a Lab, and that gets at the second reason why economists like myself are interested in education policy. Economists as a whole, as a group, are really interested in causality. But we're not afforded the luxury of laboratories like some of my other colleagues in other colleges are, where we get lots of control to see every impact of a particular treatment. That's okay because economists and social sciences have developed lots of statistical methodologies that account for this and still allow us to connect like policy A with effect B in these sort of non-laboratory settings. That's important for me because if I'm studying education and education policy, well, I can't randomly assign a treatment to a student in a classroom the way that a chemist or a biologist would be able to randomly assign an experimental drug to a mouse in a laboratory. So the work that I'm going to talk to you about today is published previously or earlier this year. And what we end up looking at is a policy in Texas that measures school quality or performance. And then we're going to look at how those performance measures impact the principals that lead those schools. Why are we concerned about principals? Well, we think of principals as like a CEO of the school. And if you were to take a company and remove the CEO from that company, you'd expect that the product or the profits of that company to change. So by that same logic, if you remove a principal from a school, then the profits or the product of that school, which is learning, should also change. As I mentioned, we're doing this research in Texas. And so in Texas, the way schools are measured is they're given an accountability rating. And we can think of these accountability ratings as kind of like a report card for the school itself. There's some exemplary schools that get rated as an A school, average schools get B's and C's, and then there's some unacceptable schools that are failing or get F's. And these ratings, they're based off of standardized tests that all the students in the school have to take every year. And there's kind of two components of this. One is, did enough of your schools, a high enough percentage of the students in your school pass this standardized test every year? And then second, was there enough improvement in this pass rate relative to the prior year? We did a lot of like drilling down into like the nuts and bolts of this accountability policy in Texas, and it turns out really the thing that matters is, did enough of your students pass every single year, and not so much that growth from year to year. So in a second, picture's gonna show up a graph that shows exactly what happens when a school ends up getting past that minimum threshold, okay? What's gonna happen is that their likelihood of escaping that failing rating jumps by 90%, okay? But really what's going on just to either side of this red line is that the difference between these schools is often as random as a handful of students got a better night's sleep the night before the exam, or maybe ate a little bit healthier breakfast the morning of the exam. As it relates to school principals, when they're in a passing school, they're 20% more likely to keep their job. So when you hear this on the surface, it seems like, well, at least in Texas where we're studying this, the system's getting rid of ineffective principals and keeping the good principals around. And if we end up looking at a graph like this that shows the distribution of principal quality based on this pass rate, it certainly looks like these unacceptable principals with the solid line are skewed lower than all the passing principals. But we have to think, is that really how we should measure principal effectiveness? What if we think about achievement gains by students over time? That's really what learning is, right? And if we graph that distribution, well, this tremendous amount of overlap in this graph shows that it's much harder to distinguish these failing principals from their passing counterparts. In fact, many of the failing principals do at least as good a job, if not a better job, in terms of achievement gains than their passing counterparts, yet they're punished by this accountability system and less likely to keep their job. And as we already talked about, that's bound to have some implications for the students they serve. And let's just be honest, the students that they serve are often not the students from affluent suburbs, they're the students from disadvantaged areas. And this policy had an unintended consequence of disadvantaging them even more. Now, I don't want to end on a dour note, so the nice thing about this research is that my co-authors and I were able to team up with some school districts in Texas, and we were able to design some policy that incentivized very effective educators to move into schools with very disadvantaged students, and the results of that work have been, by and large, very positive for everybody involved. So thank you for letting me share my research with you guys today. If you have any questions for me, I don't have a presentation, but just find me in the meet and greet and the networking session. I'm happy to talk to any of you guys. Thank you so much.